January 28th, 1986, 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time. The Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 73 seconds later, it exploded. 7 astronauts died. Millions watched it happen live on television. But this isn't a story about what happened that day. Everyone knows what happened. The explosion, the Y-shaped plume of smoke, the falling debris, the national trauma. This is a story about the man who knew exactly how it would fail, who fought like hell to stop it, and who lost everything for being right. Roger Boisjoly. He was a mechanical engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters that would propel Challenger into space. And on the night of January 27th, 1986, he sat in a conference room in Utah, staring at temperature data that should have terrified everyone in the room. The forecast for tomorrow's launch, 30 degrees Fahrenheit at Cape Canaveral. The coldest shuttle launch ever attempted, by 18 degrees. Roger Boisjoly. He had photographic proof of what cold weather did to the rubber O-rings that sealed the joints of those massive rocket boosters. And he had hours of test results showing that below 53 degrees, those seals would not work properly. They launched at 36 degrees anyway. But before we get to that frozen morning in Florida, before we get to the teleconference, where managers told engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats, before we get to the moment when Boisjoly watched 7 people die exactly the way he said they would, we need to understand how he discovered the problem in the first place. Because this story doesn't begin with the Challenger disaster. It begins more than a year earlier, with a different shuttle, a different flight, and a discovery that should have changed everything. January 24th, 1985. Space Shuttle Discovery landed successfully after Mission 51C. Standard post-flight procedure required inspection and disassembly of the solid rocket boosters. The twin boosters, each 116 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter, had performed their job. They'd burned through their solid propellant, separated from the shuttle, parachuted into the Atlantic Ocean, been recovered, and returned to Morton Thiokol's facility in Utah for refurbishment. Roger Boisjoly was assigned to the SEAL Task Force. His job was to examine the joints where the booster segments connected. Each solid rocket booster was constructed from 4 cylindrical steel segments stacked on top of each other. The joints between these segments had to remain absolutely sealed during launch. Hot combustion gases inside the booster burned at nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If those gases escaped through a joint, the result would be catastrophic. The sealing system used 2 rubber O-rings. Each O-ring sat in a groove in the joint. The primary O-ring was supposed to seal immediately upon ignition, as combustion pressure forced it against the metal surfaces. The secondary O-ring served as a backup, positioned just behind the primary. In theory, the primary O-ring would seal perfectly. The secondary would never be needed. In theory. Boisjoly opened the joint from the right solid rocket booster. What he found made him stop. The primary O-ring was gone, not damaged. Gone, completely eroded, burned away to ash. The secondary O-ring showed heat damage, deep, concerning erosion. It had sealed, barely. If the secondary had failed, if those hot gases had escaped through the joint during the launch, there would have been no shuttle, no crew, no recovery. Just an explosion that would have vaporized the launch pad and everyone on it. Roger Boisjoly documented everything. He photographed the damage. He measured the erosion depth. And he noted something crucial in the mission records. The temperature at launch time had been 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest shuttle launch on record. Meanwhile, another detail caught his attention. The joint hadn't just suffered O-ring erosion. The combustion gases had blown past the primary seal entirely, a phenomenon engineers called blow-by. The hot gases had reached the secondary O-ring before it sealed. This wasn't supposed to happen. The primary O-ring was supposed to seal within milliseconds of ignition. But, in cold weather, the rubber hardened. It lost flexibility, and in those critical milliseconds after ignition, the O-ring couldn't expand fast enough to fill the gap. Roger Boisjoly began pulling data from previous flights. He found a pattern. The colder the launch temperature, the more O-ring damage. It wasn't random. It was correlation. On warmer launches, minimal damage. On colder launches, significant erosion. The rubber was temperature sensitive. Everyone knew this. Rubber gets hard when cold, loses elasticity, takes longer to compress and expand. Basic material science. But here's what made it terrifying. 53 degrees Fahrenheit wasn't even that cold. Not by normal standards. It was mild. Room temperature was 70 degrees. 53 was just slightly cool. And at 53 degrees, the primary O-ring had failed completely. What would happen at 40 degrees, at 30 degrees, at freezing? Boisjoly wrote his findings. He presented them to management. He recommended immediate action. The O-ring sealing capability needed to be evaluated at lower temperatures. Testing needed to be done. And until they understood the problem, launches in cold weather should be reconsidered. His managers agreed to form a task force. Boisjoly was made a member. The SEAL task force would investigate O-ring behavior and recommend solutions. Progress was slow, too slow. Meanwhile, shuttles kept launching, and more cold weather flights showed more O-ring damage. By July 1985, Boisjoly's frustration had reached a breaking point. The task force had no budget, no dedicated resources, no urgency from management. Engineers were expected to work on the SEAL problem in their spare time between other assignments. On July 31st, 1985, Boisjoly wrote a memo. Not a routine engineering report, a warning. The memo went to Robert Lund, Vice President of Engineering at Morton Thiokol. The subject line read, SRM O-ring erosion, potential failure criticality. SRM stood for solid rocket motor. Boisjoly's memo was blunt. He outlined the history of O-ring damage. He explained the temperature correlation. He detailed the blow-by phenomenon. And then he wrote the words that would become famous after the disaster. It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem with the field joint having the number one priority, then we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all the launch pad facilities. He wasn't finished. The next sentence was even more direct. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order. Loss of human life. Catastrophe of the highest order. Loss of human life. Not might. Not could. Would. The memo Worked. Sort of. Management elevated the seal problem to criticality 1. In NASA's classification system, criticality 1 meant failure would result in loss of vehicle and crew. It was the highest priority designation. But here's the problem with criticality. 1 status. Several components on the shuttle already had that designation. The main engines, the external tank, other systems. Criticality 1 didn't mean launches would stop. It meant the risk was acknowledged, accepted, managed. And managed risk, in NASA's culture, meant acceptable risk. Through late 1985, the task force continued working. Tests were conducted. Redesigns were proposed. But the process was slow. Engineering takes time. Testing takes time. Redesigning a solid rocket booster joint takes time. And NASA's launch schedule didn't wait. 1986 was supposed to be a landmark year. 15 shuttle flights planned, the most ambitious schedule yet. Proof that the space shuttle was operational, routine, reliable. Meanwhile, more flights showed more O-ring damage, but the secondary O-ring always held. The backup always worked, until it wouldn't. In December 1985, Roger Boisjoly met with management again. His message was stark. If the problem was not fixed, there was a distinct chance that a shuttle mission would end in disaster. Not a possibility. A chance. A real, quantifiable probability. No action was taken. The launch schedule continued. January 1986 arrived. The new year, the ambitious schedule, and a mission that would capture America's attention more than any since the moon landings. Mission 51L, the teacher in space flight. Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, would become the first civilian in space. The flight was scheduled for January 22nd, then delayed to the 23rd, then the 24th, then the 25th, then the 26th. Weather delays, technical issues, the normal problems that plague complex launches. The new launch date, January 28th. On January 26th, weather forecasters began tracking a cold front moving across the southeastern United States. Unseasonably cold, Arctic air pushing south. Temperatures in Florida would drop dramatically. By January 27th, the forecast was clear. Overnight temperatures would fall to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By launch time, mid-morning on the 28th, temperatures would recover only to the mid-30s, maybe 36 degrees. 36 degrees Fahrenheit at launch time, at Cape Canaveral, in Florida, where they launched rockets specifically because Florida never got that cold. NASA had never launched a shuttle below 53 degrees. The coldest previous launch, the one where Boisjoly had found the completely eroded primary O-ring, had been 53 degrees. This launch would be 17 degrees colder. What we're about to see next would become one of the most studied failures of decision-making in modern history. A teleconference where engineers would fight desperately against management, where data would be presented and dismissed, where careers would be ended and lives would be lost. But before we get to that room, before we get to the phone call that would decide the fate of 7 astronauts, there's something you need to understand about the culture at NASA and Morton Thiokol in early 1986. The space shuttle was supposed to change everything: routine access to space, 50 flights per year. Operational capability. The shuttle would launch satellites, conduct experiments, prove that space travel could be as regular as commercial aviation. But reality hadn't matched the promise. Shuttles were expensive, complex, temperamental, launches delayed constantly. Turnaround times between flights stretched longer than planned. The ambitious schedules never materialized. By 1986, political pressure was mounting. The shuttle program needed to prove itself, needed to show reliability, needed to demonstrate that billions of dollars in investment had been worthwhile. President Reagan's State of the Union address was scheduled for January 28th. That evening, the same day as the Challenger launch. The plan was for Reagan to mention the teacher in space during his speech, highlighting American innovation, educational inspiration, triumph of the space program. The launch couldn't be delayed again. Too much attention, too much publicity, too much political capital invested. Meanwhile, at Morton Thiokol, a different kind of pressure existed. The company held a $1 billion contract to produce solid rocket boosters for NASA. $1 billion. Future contracts depended on NASA's satisfaction, on being a reliable partner, on not causing delays. When your customer is unhappy, future business is at risk. But there was another factor, more insidious, more dangerous. Normalization of deviance. Sociologist Diane Vaughan would later study the Challenger disaster extensively. She identified a pattern. When something outside normal parameters happens and doesn't result in disaster, the abnormal becomes normal. The exception becomes the rule. The acceptable risk becomes the accepted risk. The O-rings had been damaged on previous flights, sometimes significantly, but the shuttle had never failed. The secondary O-ring had always held. Engineers called this evidence that the design worked. Look, the backup system performed exactly as intended. But that's not what it proved. It proved they'd been lucky. Each flight with O-ring damage should have been a warning. Instead, it became proof that the damage was acceptable. By January 1986, damaged O-rings weren't anomalies requiring investigation. They were expected, documented, within the range of experience. This is what normalization of deviance looks like. The gradual acceptance of degrading standards, the slow erosion of safety margins, the comfortable belief that because disaster hasn't happened yet, it won't happen. Until it does. On the afternoon of January 27th, engineers at Morton Thiokol's facility in Wasatch, Utah, received the weather forecast for the next morning's launch. Overnight low, 18 degrees. Launch temperature, mid-30s. Roger Boisjoly saw the forecast and knew immediately what had to happen. The launch had to be delayed. He contacted his supervisor, Bob Ebeling, manager of the ignition system and final assembly team. Ebeling agreed. They needed to inform management. They needed to recommend against launching. By early evening, a teleconference was arranged between Morton Thiokol in Utah and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. The topic: the effect of cold temperature on O-ring performance. The engineers would present their data, their concerns, their recommendation, and NASA would make the decision. This was standard procedure. NASA had a formal flight readiness review process. Every shuttle subsystem had to be declared ready to fly. Every contractor had to sign off. If Morton Thiokol, the manufacturer of the solid rocket boosters, said the boosters weren't ready, NASA couldn't launch. It should have been simple. The engineers had the data. The temperature would be outside all previous experience. The O-rings had shown damage at 53 degrees. Nobody knew what would happen at 36 degrees. The prudent decision, the only responsible decision, was to delay the launch until temperatures were within the demonstrated safe range. What happened instead would become a case study in failed leadership, institutional pressure, and the cost of ignoring technical experts. The teleconference began at 5:45 p.m. Mountain Time on January 27th. Morton Thiokol's participants gathered in 2 conference rooms in Utah. NASA personnel were in Alabama and Florida. About 34 people on the call. Roger Boisjoly and Arnie Thompson, another engineer on the SEAL task force, prepared the technical presentation. They had photos. They had data. They had graphs showing the temperature correlation. The presentation was clear. Cold temperature affected O-ring resilience. The term resilience was specific. It meant how quickly the rubber could compress and expand, how fast it could seal. At low temperatures, resilience decreased dramatically. The O-rings hardened. They couldn't move fast enough. Boisjoly showed photos of O-ring damage from the January 1985 flight, the 53-degree launch. Primary O-ring destroyed. Secondary O-ring showing significant erosion. This was the worst damage they'd ever seen. And that was at 53 degrees. Tomorrow's launch would be at least 17 degrees colder. What would the O-rings look like at 36 degrees? Nobody knew. They'd never tested at those temperatures. They'd never launched at those temperatures. This would be an experiment, with 7 people on board. Roger Boisjoly's presentation was passionate, forceful. He wasn't just presenting data, he was sounding an alarm. We cannot launch outside our experience base, he argued. We have no data for temperatures this low. We cannot predict O-ring behavior. Arnie Thompson supported him. He focused on the blow-by phenomenon. Even at 53 degrees, hot gases had bypassed the primary O-ring and reached the secondary. If blow-by happened again, if the secondary O-ring was compromised by hot gases before it seated, there would be no seal, no backup, just an open path for combustion gases to escape. The engineering case was complete, unambiguous, based on data, not speculation. The recommendation was clear. Do not launch until temperatures rise to at least 53 degrees, the lowest temperature in the experience base. Morton Thiokol's management caucused briefly. Then Joe Kilminster, Vice President of Space Booster Programs, delivered Morton Thiokol's official recommendation to NASA. Do not launch Challenger until the O-ring temperature reached at least 53 degrees Fahrenheit. This was extraordinary. NASA had never received a formal no-go recommendation from a major contractor on launch day. The flight readiness review process was designed to identify problems. Yes, but by this late stage, most issues were resolved. Contractors signed off. NASA launched. A no-go recommendation was serious. It meant something was fundamentally wrong. It meant launching would be unsafe. NASA's response shocked the engineers. George Hardy, Deputy Director of Marshall Space Flight Center's Science and Engineering Directorate, spoke first. His voice was sharp, frustrated. "I am appalled," he said. I am appalled by your recommendation." Another NASA manager, Lawrence Malloy, deputy manager of the Solid Rocket Booster Program, was even more pointed. "My God, Thiokol," he said. "When do you want me to launch? Next April?" The message was clear. This recommendation was unacceptable. NASA wanted to launch. NASA needed to launch. Morton Thiokol needed to reconsider. The engineers were stunned. NASA managers weren't questioning the data. They weren't presenting contradictory evidence. They weren't offering technical arguments for why the launch would be safe. They were expressing anger, frustration, impatience. NASA asked Morton Thiokol to go offline and reconsider their recommendation. At 7:05 p.m. Mountain Time, Morton Thiokol went offline. The NASA participants hung up. In the conference room in Utah, Morton Thiokol's management team held a meeting. The engineers were not invited. Roger Boisjoly, Arnie Thompson, and the other engineers who'd prepared the technical case sat in the room as managers caucused at the other end of the table. They could hear fragments of conversation, but they weren't part of the discussion. One phrase became infamous. Gerald Mason, senior vice president of Morton Thiokol's Wasatch operations, turned to Bob Lund, vice president of engineering. Mason said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. Take off your engineering hat, put on your management hat." The implication was clear. Engineering concerns were one perspective. Management concerns were another. And right now, the management perspective mattered more. The management perspective was, NASA was unhappy. NASA wanted to launch. Morton Thiokol's relationship with NASA was at stake. A $1 billion contract was at stake. Future business was at stake. The engineering perspective was 7 people might die. The managers voted. 4 managers. All 4 voted to reverse the no-go recommendation. Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering, the man who'd received Boisjoly's warning memo 6 months earlier, voted to launch. Roger Boisjoly and Arnie Thompson were not given a vote. They were engineers. This was a management decision. At approximately 8:00 p.m. Mountain Time, Morton Thiokol called NASA back. Joe Kilminster read the new recommendation. Morton Thiokol now supported launching Challenger. The reversal was complete, from formal no-go to go in less than an hour. NASA asked if there were any objections, any dissenting voices, any concerns. There were none, officially. The engineers weren't asked. NASA approved the launch for 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, January 28th. Roger Boisjoly went home that night, knowing what was going to happen, or thinking. He knew. He expected the booster to explode on the pad during ignition. He thought the O-rings would fail immediately, hot gases would escape, and the shuttle would never leave the ground. It would be catastrophic, but at least it would be contained. The crew would die instantly, the pad would be destroyed, but the disaster would be limited. He was wrong about the timing, but he was right about everything else. What Boisjoly didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that the failure would happen slowly, that the secondary O-ring would hold barely for 73 seconds. That Challenger would lift off, clear the tower, and climb toward the sky before the seal finally failed. But before we get to that frozen morning in Florida, there's one more detail you need to understand about January 27th, 1986. Roger Boisjoly knew the launch would fail. Thompson knew. Ebeling knew. Other engineers knew. They'd presented the data. They'd made the case. They'd issued the warning. And they'd been overruled. That night, Roger couldn't sleep. He told his wife what was going to happen. He said the shuttle would probably blow up. She asked if he'd done everything he could. He said yes. He'd done everything possible. He'd talked to the right people, the people with the power to stop the launch. There was nothing more he could do, except watch. January 28th, 1986. Kennedy Space Center. Launch pad 39. B. Ice-covered. Icicles hung from the fixed service structure. Frost coated the external tank. The mobile launch platform was encased in frozen condensation. Ground crews had never seen anything like it. Ice in Florida. Ice at the Cape. Ice on a launch pad. Ice inspection teams were dispatched overnight, multiple times. They checked the shuttle, the pad, the structures. Ice could break off during launch, damage the thermal protection tiles on the orbiter. Falling ice could hit critical systems. But the ice teams focused on ice falling on the shuttle. They didn't inspect the solid rocket booster joints. Those joints were sealed inside. Nobody could see the O-rings. Inside those joints, at the moment of ice inspection, the rubber O-rings had been below freezing for hours. The temperature of the right solid rocket booster's aft field joint, the joint between the two lower segments, was estimated at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The O-rings had never been that cold, not in a test, not in a flight. Nobody knew how they would behave. At Morton Thiokol's facility in Utah, engineers gathered around television monitors to watch the launch. Roger Boisjoly sat with his colleagues, waiting. He expected the explosion during ignition. The moment the solid rocket boosters fired, massive combustion pressure would slam against the O-ring joints. If the seals didn't hold, hot gases would escape immediately. The booster would rupture. The external tank would explode. It would be over in seconds. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the main engines ignited. 3 seconds later, the solid rocket boosters fired. Challenger lifted off. Boisjoly watched the shuttle rise, clear the tower, climb. He felt a surge of relief. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe the secondary O-ring would hold. Maybe they'd get lucky again. He didn't know that high-speed camera footage was capturing something invisible to the naked eye. At 0.6 seconds after ignition, a puff of dark grey smoke appeared at the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. The primary O-ring had failed completely, just as Boisjoly had predicted. Hot combustion gases burning at 5,000 degrees blew past the primary seal instantly. But the secondary O-ring moved into position. Aluminum oxide particles from the burning propellant, along with rocket fuel, created a temporary seal, a plug of debris. It held, for now. Challenger climbed. The shuttle rolled. The crew performed their checklist. Everything nominal. In Utah, Boisjoly watched the shuttle arc across the blue sky. Maybe it would be okay. At 58 seconds into flight, Challenger encountered high-altitude wind shear. The shuttle vibrated, flexed. The forces were within normal parameters, nothing dangerous, but they caused the solid rocket booster joints to flex. The temporary seal in the right booster's aft field joint cracked. At 59 seconds, a small flame appeared on the side of the right solid rocket booster. The flame grew. It wasn't visible from most camera angles. The flame was on the side of the booster facing away from the external tank. But it was burning through the booster's exterior metal casing. At 72 seconds, the flame burned through completely. It acted like a blowtorch, directed at the lower strut that attached the right solid rocket booster to the external tank. At 73 seconds, pilot Michael Smith said, "Uh-oh." Those were the last words recorded from the crew. The lower strut failed. The right solid rocket booster pivoted, its nose crashing into the external tank. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the main fuel for the shuttle's engines, poured from the ruptured tank. The hydrogen and oxygen mixed and ignited in a massive explosion. The external tank disintegrated. The forces tore Challenger apart. The two solid rocket boosters, still burning, spiraled away in different directions, creating the distinctive, Y-shaped smoke plume that would become the iconic image of the disaster. The orbiter's crew cabin, largely intact, separated from the disintegrating vehicle and began to fall. Challenger was gone. In Utah, Roger Boisjoly watched the television screen. He saw the explosion. He saw the diverging smoke trails. He saw the fireball. And he knew exactly what had happened. The primary O-ring had failed. The secondary O-ring had been compromised by blow-by. Hot gases had escaped. The seal had burned through. Everything he'd warned about, everything he'd predicted, everything he'd fought to prevent. It happened exactly the way he said it would. The crew cabin fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before hitting the Atlantic Ocean at more than 200 miles per hour. Analysis would later show that some crew members probably survived the initial breakup. They may have been conscious during the fall. 7 people dead. Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, the teacher. Millions watched it happen, including entire classrooms of children who'd tuned in to see their teacher go to space. President Reagan postponed his State of the Union address. That evening, he addressed the nation about the disaster instead. NASA grounded the shuttle fleet. An investigation began. Roger Boisjoly knew his life was about to change. Because he had documentation, he had memos. He had the July 31st memo warning of catastrophe. He had notes from the January 27th teleconference. He had evidence that engineers had tried to stop the launch. Soon, everyone would know what he knew. What he didn't expect was what would happen to him when he told the truth. President Reagan appointed a commission to investigate the disaster. The Rogers Commission, named after its chairman, former Secretary of State William Rogers. The commission included NASA officials, military officers, astronauts, engineers, and physicists. One member was Sally Ride, America's first woman in space. Another was Richard Feynman, the legendary physicist. The commission's job was to determine what happened and why. In early February, the New York Times published a front-page story. NASA had warning of a disaster risk posed by booster. The story cited concerns about O-ring failure expressed in documents obtained from an anonymous source. The anonymous source was Roger Boisjoly. He'd contacted NPR 3 weeks after the disaster. He spoke to reporter Daniel Zwerdling in a hotel room in Alabama, revealing the details of the fight to stop the launch. He wasn't named. He was identified only as an engineer. But Boisjoly knew he couldn't stay anonymous. The commission would find the memos. They'd find the documents. They'd want testimony. On February 25th, Boisjoly testified before the Rogers Commission in a closed session. He brought 14 boxes of documents. Every note, every memo, every piece of paper from 7 years of work on the solid rocket boosters. He handed them to General Donald Kutina, a member of the commission. Morton Thiokol's lawyers had instructed Boisjoly to answer questions with yes or no only. Do not volunteer information. Do not elaborate. Protect the company. Roger Boisjoly ignored those instructions. He told the commission everything. He described the July memo, the warning of catastrophe, the lack of management support, the January 27th teleconference, the engineering recommendation not to launch, NASA's angry response, the offline caucus, the phrase, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat, the management decision to reverse the recommendation. He testified that the decision to launch was, quote, an unethical decision-making forum resulting from intense customer intimidation. Unethical customer intimidation. He was accusing NASA and his own company's management of making a decision that prioritized politics and money over 7 human lives. When Boisjoly finished testifying, he walked out of the hearing room. One person was waiting for him, Sally Ride. She walked up to Boisjoly and hugged him. She was the only one, Boisjoly said later, the only one. Nobody else from NASA acknowledged him. Nobody from Morton Thiokol thanked him. Nobody offered support. Sally Ride, astronaut, physicist, national hero, was the only person who showed him compassion. And then Roger Boisjoly went back to Utah, back to Morton Thiokol, back to his job. Except it wasn't his job anymore. Morton Thiokol management reassigned him. He was removed from all space-related work. The SEAL task force disbanded. His engineering projects were taken away. He was given make-work assignments, busy tasks with no real purpose. His colleagues stopped talking to him. In the hallways, people avoided eye contact. In meetings, nobody addressed him. In the cafeteria, nobody sat near him. One colleague approached him and said, "If you wreck this company, I'm going to put my kids on your doorstep. Put my kids on your doorstep." As if Boisjoly was the threat. As if he'd done something wrong. As if trying to save 7 lives was betrayal. Alan MacDonald, another Morton Thiokol engineer who'd also refused to approve the launch, experienced the same treatment. MacDonald would later write in his book, Truth, Lies and O-Rings, that, quote, Roger and I already felt like lepers, but when we returned to Utah following the May 2nd session, our colleagues treated us as if we had just been arrested for child sexual abuse. Neighbors shunned him. Community members avoided him. In his own town, where he'd lived for years, people turned away. Roger Boisjoly began suffering severe headaches. He couldn't sleep. When he did sleep, he had nightmares. He saw the explosion. He saw the faces of the astronauts. He saw the smoke plume. In April 1987, NPR reporter Daniel Zwerdling visited Boisjoly at his home in Utah. Zwerdling found him thin, tearful, tense. Boisjoly sat in the corner of a couch, arms tightly folded across his chest, huddled. "I'm very angry that nobody listened," Boisjoly told Zwerdling. He asked himself constantly if he could have done anything different. Should he have gone to the press before the launch? Should he have contacted the astronauts directly? Should he have refused to work after the decision was made? But then a flash of certainty would return. "We were talking to the right people," he said. "We were talking to the people who had the power to stop that launch." Boisjoly filed lawsuits against Morton Thiokol and NASA. Both were dismissed. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. He took medical leave. In July 1987, Roger Boisjoly resigned from Morton Thiokol. "When I realized what was happening, it absolutely destroyed me," he told the Associated Press in 1988. "It destroyed my career, my life, everything else." He founded a forensic engineering consulting firm. He began accepting speaking invitations. Universities, professional organizations, corporations. Anyone who wanted to hear about engineering ethics, decision-making under pressure, institutional failure. Over the next 25 years, Boisjoly delivered more than 300 lectures. He became a symbol, a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when you do the right thing. In 1988, the American Association for the Advancement of Science awarded him the Prize for Scientific Freedom and Responsibility. He received other honors, awards for integrity, recognition for courage. But the recognition didn't undo the damage, didn't restore his career at Morton Thiokol, didn't bring back the 7 astronauts, and it didn't prevent the next disaster. February 1st, 2003. Space Shuttle Columbia re-entered Earth's atmosphere after a successful mission. During launch, a piece of foam insulation had broken off the external tank and struck Columbia's left wing. Engineers had noticed the damage. They'd analyzed video footage. They'd raised concerns. Management dismissed those concerns. Foam strikes had happened before. The shuttle had always been fine, within the range of experience, acceptable risk. Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. 7 more astronauts died. NASA had learned nothing. The same institutional failures, the same pressure to maintain schedules, the same dismissal of engineering concerns, the same normalization of deviance. 17 years after Challenger, another crew dead, another preventable disaster. Roger Boisjoly gave more speeches after Columbia. The lesson hadn't been learned, he said. The culture hadn't changed. Institutions protect themselves. They prioritize short-term goals over long-term safety. They punish whistleblowers. They normalize risk. And then it happens again. On January 6, 2012, Roger Boisjoly died at his home in Nephi, Utah. Cancer, colon, kidneys, liver. He was 73 years old. 73 years old. 1 year for every second of Challenger's final flight. The technical cause of the Challenger disaster was clear. The primary O-ring in the right solid rocket booster's aft field joint failed to seal. Cold temperature reduced the O-ring's resilience. The rubber couldn't expand fast enough. Hot combustion gases blew past the primary seal and compromised the secondary seal. A temporary plug held for 73 seconds. Wind shear at high altitude dislodged the plug. The seal burned through. Hot gases escaped and acted like a blowtorch against the external tank's structural support. The strut failed. The booster pivoted and struck the tank. The tank ruptured and exploded. Challenger broke apart. The engineering failure was predictable. Predicted. The real failure was institutional. Management ignored clear engineering data. NASA pressured a contractor to reverse a safety recommendation. Morton Thiokol managers prioritized customer relations over crew safety. And when the disaster happened, when an engineer who'd tried to prevent it told the truth about what went wrong, that engineer was destroyed. Roger Boisjoly's life became a case study, not in engineering, in ethics, in courage, in the cost of integrity. Every engineering student studies Challenger. They learn about O-rings and cold temperature and blow-by and joint rotation. They learn about the technical failure. But more importantly, they learn about the human failure, about the pressure to stay quiet, about the consequences of speaking up, about what happens when institutions value loyalty over truth, and they're asked, what would you do? If you were Roger Boisjoly, if you had the data, if you knew the launch would fail, if management overruled you, if your colleagues shunned you, if your career was destroyed, would you still tell the truth? Roger Boisjoly did, and it cost him everything. But 7 astronauts died anyway. That's the tragedy. Not that he failed, but that he succeeded, and it didn't matter. He presented the data. He issued the warning. He fought to stop the launch. He was right about everything. And they launched anyway. NASA never launched a shuttle below 53 degrees Fahrenheit again. After Challenger, after the investigation, after the redesign of the solid rocket booster joints, the temperature minimum was established. 53 degrees. The number Boisjoly had specified on January 27th, 1986. He was right then. They just didn't listen. At Roger Boisjoly's memorial service, his brother said, "He tried to be the brother of those Challenger astronauts. He tried. He fought. He warned." And when it happened anyway, when 7 people died, exactly the way he said they would, he told the world the truth about Warning. Even though it destroyed him. Roger Boisjoly understood something that institutions don't want to accept. Some things matter more than your career, more than your relationships, more than your comfort. 7 human lives matter more. On January 28th, 1986, at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 73 seconds later, 7 astronauts were dead. One engineer had tried to save them. He did everything right and lost everything anyway.